Thank you so much for joining me, Shannon. I know that you wrote an amazing piece back in 2018 about the making of the I Put a Spell on You scene from the first film. So, is that where this all stemmed from? How did the book come about?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's very kind. I did write a piece in 2018 about that specific scene. It was also an oral history for Bustle, a website in the US that hopefully people know. But it was about that specific scene, and it was about tied to the anniversary, and it was very simply a pitch I sent to my editor at that time. At the time, I was like maybe a little naive that I didn't realize. I think in my mind, I was like, oh, this is a movie. I'm going to do this, and there's going to be a small group of people who are going to be really interested in this, because the Hocus Pocus community, I did not know at the time how big it was and how much it was thriving even then. So when I wrote it, I was thinking, oh, this is like a fun little piece. And it wound up doing very well on their site. I remember them telling me, I think it was, one of the higher trafficked pieces of that year, which, I was sort of like, wow, this is just a piece where I spoke to people about this very specific scene. I can't believe that many people are clicking on it. And from there, years later, I got an email from an agent who had read that piece as well and thought it could be something more, and sort of asked me, would you be interested in doing more with this, doing something that was about the whole movie, not just that scene, going further. And I was a little skeptical at first that it was real. I mean, I think if someone just cold emails you about doing a piece, you're sort of like, or writing a book, you're like, okay, this has to be a scam, right? So I did a little bit of Googling before I agreed to sort of speak to this agent, but it was all above board. And we had a really nice conversation, and I sort of talked about, the different elements of the movie that I would love to dig into, which basically became the outline for the book, and stuck very similar to that, pretty much from the beginning to the end. The chapters that you see, that was sort of the outline. There maybe was new information I found that was added to those chapters, but that was kind of, that framework really stayed in place. I think something that was really interesting for that piece that I had originally done, I had gotten to interview David Kirshner, creator David Kirshner. I got to interview Thora Birch. I got to interview Stephanie Faracy, who plays, Danny's mom, and Max's mom. And I got to speak to Joseph Malone, who plays the skeleton singer, who was just great to speak to, who hadn't done like a ton of interviews about the movie. And I think because I was able to get so many people, I had the confidence, I think, to be like, oh, I can reach out to everyone and get them for this book. But yeah, it really just started out as, that piece really did lead to the book. It's sort of amazing. It's not always how this stuff works. I've been a journalist for a while and written many pieces, and this was the first one that someone had sort of come to me and be like, do you think you could do something more with it? And it was, I was really excited to try.
I love that. Yeah, that must have been so exciting. For the interviews, did you source them yourself, and did you meet them in person, or was it like this? Did you speak to them on video or anything? How did you, or did Disney give you like a Hocus Pocus phone book of contacts for the
I wish
interviews?
I could tell you I have like a little Hocus Pocus black book or something with all of the contacts, sort of magical book, my own book. I do not. It was a lot of me cold emailing people and saying, hey, I'm working on this project. Would you be willing to speak to me? And to everyone's credit who spoke to me, they said yes, to someone who they do not know, sort of saying, hey, can you tell me some of your personal stories from this time in your life? And I mean, it's amazing that people say yes to you. I think that's like the thing that maybe people don't understand, which is, no one is obligated to speak to me for this book. And so many people were willing to tell their story because this movie means so much, and because of what a fascinating story it is, that it started out as something that, I don't know that Disney wants me to use this word, but, flopped. It didn't do what it was supposed to. And while I think it's such a well-made movie, and it's got so, I mean, I'm not the only one who thinks this, but I think, people missed out on that the first time around. It came out in the summer, people weren't ready for it, whatever the reasons were, it just didn't, make it. But I think because of the phenomenon it's become, people are really happy to speak about it. It was a story that could have been a sad one, that this movie didn't work out and they had so much fun on the set, but instead now it's this sort of, crazy story about a movie that that could, a movie that shouldn't have, it should be in a bargain bin somewhere, that has become this, phenomenon every Halloween season, you whether you want to or not. And I think most of us don't want it to leave us, but like, if whether you want to watch it or not, it is there for you to watch it. You cannot sort of get away from it during this time. I did not meet really anyone in person, mostly because of COVID. It was still sort of that time where, it was difficult to meet people. It was difficult to travel for safety reasons. I could understand people. It was safer for us to meet on Zoom or on a phone call, which I think you meet someone in person, there's something that it becomes a little more intimate. But I feel like because of Zoom, and we were also used to being on Zoom, there was a way to build that intimacy there and build that rapport, that I think that because we were so used to it, it didn't feel like maybe in the past you would have said, oh, you just talked to them over the phone or just over email. And I spoke to a lot of these people multiple times. They were really kind with their time, where they would get on the phone or get on a Zoom, and we would spend an hour or more just talking. And then maybe I would have follow-up questions, to make sure, or someone else would tell me a story and I'd say, oh, I got to go back to Doug Jones and ask him this, or I got to go back to Omri and ask him about this. So, there's a lot of time that people spend speaking to you. So I think if anything, it would have been great to meet everyone in person, but I think there was something about us all kind of knowing the kind of time we were living in, that made it kind of nice to get on a Zoom call or a phone call and like really speak about these things.
It's interesting. I never really thought of it, but the fact, what you just said, that the film was a flop, it didn't do as well as probably a lot of people hoped, probably means that everyone that you reached did have stories that they've sort of kept inside, that they've never really got to share, because it's only just recently that people have started to be interested in the film, and they've been holding on to these behind the scenes stories, and some of them in the book are quite personal stories and quite, so I love that. This is probably an impossible question. Did you have a fave interviewee?
It's not impossible, but it's just so difficult, because I feel like I don't think there was any interview that I did where I didn't come out of it and say, oh, that story, where there was something from it where I was like, oh, that's a great story, or that's a great little secret or something. So I'm like, it's tough, because I feel like every interview I could give you like my favorite moment from every interview, which I think, again, a testament to everyone who I spoke to, who was so willing to answer my questions. And I hope, I wasn't trying to pry into people's lives, or I wasn't trying to like focus on anything that was, negative or would make someone feel bad. But I'm sure I asked tough questions that maybe just forced them to think about something, people who maybe at the time there was sadness. I mean, I think that comes up in the book of like when it was first released, how sort of disappointing it was, especially for some of the actors who were so young when they were in it, and this was their first experience. And you get the sense, I hope from reading the book, how much fun it was to make it, and how much, tenderness and love went into making this. And then to have it sort of get the response it did was really tough, was like really difficult. And I think that was something I wanted to make sure was in the book, that it wasn't just, oh, it just became so popular. Like there's such a middle area. There's such a like long period of time before people started to care about it. And so I feel like I really wanted to make sure that we talked about that time too, as hard as it might be to sort of go back to that part. But I think everyone was willing to do it, because this movie has become so popular that that part feels like par for the course. Like it just was part of this story, and it makes the movie's popularity even more, I think, amazing. It makes it so much more important of a story to be like, wow, we really thought this movie was done. We thought it was something where occasionally someone's going to say, oh, Hocus Pocus, but it wasn't going to be something where it is now, where it's like, it's pretty much everyone who's in it now, it's maybe it's the biggest movie they're in by far.
Again, interesting what you said there, the long period of time from the film coming out to it gaining popularity. If you watch interviews on YouTube with Kathy or Bet, and they bring up Hocus Pocus, they almost seem apologetic for it, and sort of like they don't want to talk about it. Like, you may have heard of this film that I did like a few years ago called Hocus Pocus. I played a witch. And it's crazy now looking at those interviews, because Now everyone knows what it is, and they should definitely not be apologetic or embarrassed by it. I think what I took away from the book, I knew from the behind the scenes footage that there was so much love and effort and attention to detail put in, but the amount of detail that went in, I didn't quite fully comprehend until reading your book and hearing from Mick Garris and David Kirshner, like the minute details that went into everything. And now, like I said to you before, after reading the book, I have like this further love for the film that now anytime I watch it, I'll have all these stories from the book now playing in the back of my head. That's not a question. That was just me telling you
Well,
that.
thank you. That's very sweet. I mean, obviously, you hope that's what people take away, because I think that's what I got from it too, which is this was a movie I grew up loving, but I didn't really know a ton about the making of. And I think, I think sometimes we watch it now and we're so used to CGI that when you see some of these, practical effects, it can be, you can sort of say, oh, that's sweet. That's sweet that they did it that way. What a nice thing. But then when you hear how it was made and how kind of painstaking it was to get this cat to move its mouth, or to train these cats, or to any aspect of flying, and how painful it probably was for the women doing this. I think it really, like you said, gives you a new appreciation. I hope it gives other people too, but it gave me a new appreciation for just filmmaking and what the talent that was on set, not just on screen, but behind the scenes. How many of these people still work in Hollywood, and they work on big projects, and they're part of the Marvel universe, and they do all of these things that I think now you're like, this was a stepping stone for a lot of them, even though it wasn't as successful. I think you hear that in a lot of people where they say, oh, maybe the fans didn't quite get it or the critics didn't quite get it, but within Hollywood, there were people who really saw the craft that went into this, and like it led to them getting other jobs because they were so talented. So I think there's all those little fun things that you find out that for a lot of these people, especially on the crew, I think specifically, they made this movie and it was kind of like, okay, let's on to the next project. That's what happens. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And this one didn't seem to work. And now they're very shocked, especially, again, the crew is very shocked by when people are like, oh my gosh, you made Hocus Pocus. I think there's like a great story about one of the casting directors or associate casting directors who talks about going to Trader Joe's and being online, and someone at the the cashier is talking about the movie, and she just sort of says, oh, I was part of that movie, and the person sort of loses it. And I think that's like was some of the fun things to hear about, was how they're sort of, I don't know, tickled by how much people love this, and like what it means when they say, oh yeah, I worked on that, and people just sort of like their eyes light up and they're so excited. And I think that's something they could have never imagined with this film because of the initial reaction to it. So I think all of that stuff, like you said, I hope that people, like you sort of said, get the idea that like these movies are so tough to make. I think it gives you more, maybe, I hope, respect for what people do. I think it's easy to say, oh, that movie stinks or whatever. And I think when you kind of know what it took to make it, you can't help but try to find something good in whatever you're watching. And I hope maybe people will do that when they watch other movies, that even if you don't like it or you don't think it works, I hope that there's maybe something in it that you say, I feel like that person really worked hard on that. Or I don't know, you find something to look to say like, this really is these are such labor of loves, most movies. Even if stuff goes wrong on set, like there's just so much care that goes into it. People want these movies to be good. People don't work on these things for months and months of their lives to have it be a failure. They work on it in hopes that it will find an audience, or critics will love it, or people will love it and they will talk about it. So I think that this movie is such a testament to that, the labor of love that goes into making these movies. And sometimes you get lucky and it finds an audience. And I mean, this movie has found an audience in a huge way,
I want to know where your love of Hocus Pocus stemmed from. Can you remember the first time you saw it? When was it? And what about the film drew you to it so much that you wanted to write an essay about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the first time. I wish I did. It was something I feel like I tried to figure out by asking my mom. Like I interviewed my mom and my dad at one point, which isn't really in the book. It was just more for background for myself, where I was like, do you remember the first time I saw this movie? And, because I was of the age where it came out when I was alive. So I could have seen it in the theaters. I did not, like most people, did not catch it in the theaters until I was older. I caught it in the theaters last year for the first time, which was an amazing experience. But I just loved it from the beginning. My parents rented it from Blockbuster and we watched it. And my mom's sort of story was, and I've told this a few times, which is that, she just was like, you kept wanting to watch it. So I knew I had to buy it because like we were going to be renting this movie way too much. So it was just easier to buy it. And I feel like I still like remember the like cover, like the like spine of that cover, like sitting on my parents' shelf. Like it's such an important movie. And it kind of like is my fandom as a kid was like Beetlejuice and the Addams Family and Hocus Pocus. I clearly loved those sort of creepy, a little scary, but very stylish and maybe a little campy movies. Like they really worked on me. So this kind of felt like, when I think about it now, I was like, oh, this is very much in line with, even as a kid, like what I was into. So there is something really sweet about getting to write about it. And maybe, I don't know. I think, these are the kind of movies when you're a kid that like maybe you get older and people are just like, they're just silly kids movies. And it was fun to like really do the exercise of looking at this in a very serious way. I mean, there's a lot of funny stories in the book. I hope people find them funny. I found it really fun and funny, but there is, it was serious work to make this movie. And I think I wanted to treat it like that. It's not The Godfather, but at the same time, it has these stories within the making of it that are just as fascinating. And I hope that people see that it's, it's a real movie. It's not just a kid's movie. There's something more to it. And there's a lot of, like I said, craft and that's taken in. I mean, I think you brought up that like for a while, maybe some of the actresses didn't quite want to talk about their role in it. But, now Bette Midler says it's her favorite role that she's ever done. It's her favorite character. I mean, that to me is a testament to the fans who have made this a real movie. They have made this more than just a cult classic. They've made this more than a kid's movie. It is a legitimate, it is legitimate. People take it seriously, even if it's fun serious. They take, it's not just a little movie that, okay, you watch it every Halloween. There's so many people I spoke to who are like, I watch this movie all year round. This is like my comfort movie. This is a movie that I go to. And I think, that's no different than some of the other classic movies we talk about, Wizard of Oz. These are movies that people grew up with and they're so important to them. And I feel like Hocus Pocus has that for a lot of people. I mean, myself included, it's such a part of my childhood. It was something I watched every year, When it started to become popular, I was sort of fascinated because I was like, oh, I thought I was the only one who knew this movie. But at the same time also was like, well, everyone watched it because it's just that movie. It's the Halloween movie that you go to.
It is a legitimate film now, and it's interesting you brought up The Godfather because I remember thinking for years I'd go into a bookstore and they would be making of books of all these big films like The Godfather, The Shining, all these books. And I would always, and I said this to you before, I would always think, where's the making of book for Hocus Pocus? Now we have one, so thank you.
I mean, I think, like you said, the stories behind any movie I think are really fascinating, and some are more outrageous than others. I think, there's the Apocalypse Now where you're like, the story of that movie getting made is insane, heart attacks and all these different things. But I think like, while that's not something that comes up in Hocus Pocus, it's no less interesting to hear, how they got all the pumpkins or how the pumpkins rotted when they bought them and they had to figure out a new way to do it, or trying to make it look like fall when it wasn't totally fall. So they had to paint leaves. I mean, these are stories that come from this movie that I think are just fascinating and tell you about a little bit about the magic of filmmaking. Some of this stuff is so like kind of silly, and even when they're retelling those stories, they're kind of like, can you believe that? Like, can you believe that we had to ship in all these pumpkins? Can you like, I think that stuff is so fascinating. And like I said, it was really fun to hear those stories because I think that some of those, this is a movie that wasn't written about a ton because, I mean, now people write about it all the time and there's all these different lists, but luckily it was not something that people had really dug into. I wasn't the first person to write about it, but I was able to go longer than some of these people could. They're great journalists. Andy Ortiz is one I'm thinking of, who wrote like a little oral history of it, just about how it got so popular. And those were so helpful to me because someone had started to do that research, but they just didn't have like the room to do as much reporting as I could. They couldn't speak to 100 people because they had a deadline. They had a real deadline. But I feel like there's so many people who added to my reporting by me reading their pieces. I could find new questions, or I could say, okay, this person already spoke about this, but what about this? I think that's the fun part. And I'm sure someone will do the same. There's still secrets out there to Hocus Pocus that I couldn't uncover yet. Hope maybe one day I could, but I couldn't uncover them. And I hope that other people will maybe read the book and say, oh, you know what? She totally missed this. Why didn't she ask this person this and go ask that question? Like, I don't think it's, I want to say it's definitive, but it's not. There's so many things that could still be answered. There's people I didn't get to speak to. There's people who unfortunately are no longer with us where their stories might be lost, or maybe someone will read the book who was a part of the process and say, oh my gosh, you know what, I remember. And I hope that they call me up and tell me them, because I would love to hear them.
Again, I love that you've been able to merge your love of Hocus Pocus with your role as a journalist. But would you ever want to try and write a novel set in the Hocus Pocus universe, or a fan fiction style, or maybe a spin-off or anything?
I think my background is so nonfiction that I can't even imagine, being a novelist, writing something. I think it would be, I'm sure it would be the most fun, but I don't think that's my skill set. But I would love to read that. I would love to talk to the person who writes those books. I love that the world can grow through other writers, that this is maybe something that is sort of, along with the other Hocus Pocus books, is sort of like a family of books. You could have a full shelf that's all Hocus Pocus related books, and I hope mine can be on there with it, that it's a part of the story just as much as, the sequel novel, or the beautiful illustrated version for I think more for kids, but a beautiful illustrated version of Hocus Pocus. I think all of those things come together. I hope that people think of them as sort of, a pairing, that you could watch the movie and read my book and read the sequel. And like you said, maybe there'll be more books to come. I hope there's more books to come. I think there's so much story to tell here. There's so much to do with these witches. I think the sequel did such a good job of expanding the world, even seeing the young Sandersons. I would personally love a young Sandersons movie, show, book. I think they were so lovely, and it's such a cool thing to see. But no, I probably will stick with, the nonfiction writing, and maybe write about other movies. But I love the idea that people will continue to write about this movie.
That was actually a perfect segue into one of my other questions. If you could write an oral history about any other film other than Hocus Pocus, what would it be and why?
I would love to write another book. This was really, really fun. It was a great experience. And I have ideas for other books that I'm not going to share, just because I am a person who is afraid of jinxing it. But I sort of brought up Beetlejuice. I think in my dreams, I would love to write a Beetlejuice oral history, especially since we know there's now another one. And like Hocus Pocus, it took a long time for that movie to come back. But I'm such a huge Michael Keaton fan, probably like my first favorite actor, my first crush. I loved, him in Beetlejuice. Oddly, I don't think I was attracted to him, but, I liked him in that. And I loved Mr. Mom, and I loved Batman and Batman Returns. So I feel like to talk to him, I don't even know if I could do it, because I think I would be too much of a fangirl about it. But I love Winona Ryder. I love that movie. I love Tim Burton. I feel like Tim Burton is probably the director who made me love movies. He was the first director who was a celebrity to me, because I watched everything he made, and especially all the early stuff. I just am so in love with his style. So I think if I got my dream, it would be to be able to spend time with any of the people who worked on that. I mean, especially everyone who worked on that crew. Just the production design, the costuming, everything is so wonderful in that movie and so unique. And I think that would be my dream. I don't have any plans to pitch something, but if there's someone out there who wants Beetlejuice oral history, and Michael Keaton is down, I'm there. I'm ready to do it. But I love the oral history format, because I think it's really fun to hear people's stories about this, these times, because it's one thing to write about it, but it's another thing to hear it in other people's voices, which I really loved, because I hope that comes through, that everyone has their own sort of unique voice. And I hope that, you get that when you're talking, when you hear David Kirshner, or you read David Kirshner's quote and you read Thora Birch's quote, you can tell these are two different people, right? Like talking about their experience, and you could hopefully hear their voices. That's something I do love about like an oral history or a podcast, when you can hear someone sort of speaking in their own voice, in their own words, in their own, language, their own vocabulary, I think is really fascinating.
You're so right. And I remember before the book came out, I didn't really know what the format was going to be. I didn't know if it was just going to be here's 10 pages of David Kirshner, here's 10 pages of Bette Midler. But I love the way you split it up into the different sections and you jump between people all talking about the same topic, because that just makes it so much more interesting. And like you said, going from David's voice to Thora's voice to Don Yesso, who was my personal favorite interviewee of yours. His stories were
He's
just wild.
amazing. He's amazing.
Yeah, no, I love the format of the book. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but is there anything on the horizon on the chance of an oral history of Hocus Pocus 2 or an expansion on the first book as a companion piece or anything?
You know, something that I talked about how the sort of framework for the book was the same as what I had pitched. The one thing that didn't wind up in the book was there was a chapter about Hocus Pocus 2, and I did report it out, and I had some really great quotes and things, but it didn't quite feel like it fit. I think because sort of like you said, the second one has its own story, and there is so much to it that I think like you couldn't fit it all. I was trying to fit it into one chapter, but it felt like, oh no, there's so much more here. And so, I hope that one day my reporting can be used in a book. I would love to continue to tell the story of Hocus Pocus. I really think the second one, there's such a fun, unique story to it, just for how long it took and sort of the process of getting it made and everyone in it. And, obviously this is another filming during COVID. I mean, there's stories about that and how it made things a little more difficult or different. And, I think that stuff is all fascinating and could be its own book, even if it's a smaller book. I think there's something there. And I love sort of the way a young fan base seems to love Hocus Pocus 2. I think some of the most fun things I learned was people saying, I grew up with Hocus Pocus and I love it, but my kids love Hocus Pocus 2. So I hope that there is a world where that movie does become someone's Hocus Pocus, that becomes the Hocus Pocus for a different generation. But I think that, as far as I know, there are no plans for something more, but I would love to be a part of it if there is. And again, I hope there is, because I think there's a really interesting story there. And as far as will there be more to this book, I sort of like to leave it open. There's people I didn't get to speak to who, if for any reason they would like to speak to me now, I would take the phone call in a second. So I sort of think of it as open-ended. I guess in my dreams, people I didn't get to speak to see the book or maybe possibly read the book, or someone reads the book and tells them about it. And they say, oh, not that I got something wrong, but maybe they're like, she didn't get the full story here. I'd love to tell her the real story. I would love that. And I would love for it to be added into a paperback edition or some sort of anniversary edition. I mean, that's, I think, the dream. To me, I'm like, it's sort of alive. It's done because it's published. But I think, there's nothing that stops you from adding things. I think some of my favorite oral histories, like the SNL book, they have added chapters to it because there's still so much story to tell. And so I hope that, there can be anniversary editions of the book where I could add something new or talk to new people, or, maybe there's stuff that I still have in my reporting that I couldn't add here, but because I maybe needed more, I needed more voices or I needed confirmation. There's tons of stuff like that where you hear someone tells you a story, but, you can't just put something in and say, this is factual because one person told you. You have to find other people to sort of tell the story. And I hope that's clear in the book that it's, there's sometimes where you hear people talk about the same thing for a page, and it's mostly to show like a lot of people had the same opinion on this, a lot of people agreed with this. But then there's other stories where you'll see someone says something and someone kind of doesn't contradict it, but sort of says, no, I don't remember it that way. And to me, that's important too, to show that like everyone's memory is so different, right? And so when you get people who say, this moment happened, but four people tell you different ways that it happened, I'm like, I think it's important to put all of those in there, because you can kind of get the sense that it's like no one quite remembers, or maybe there's a version of events that's sort of true. We're sort of like, maybe everyone's events are kind of true, and I think that stuff's important. So, this is all to say that, yes, if someone would like to talk to me about anything in the book, I would love to talk to you. That's fans included. I think the most fun thing about this whole process has been getting messages from Hocus Pocus fans who will tell me, I like this part, or this, I didn't know that. I think that was obviously my goal, was to hopefully write a book that that could be interesting to fans and non-fans alike, but it's really rewarding when you hear people who you know are very well versed in this movie say, I didn't know that, or I haven't heard them speak about that, or oh my gosh, you got this person, I've never heard them talk about the movie. That's so rewarding, and I feel like that was like sort of my goal, was to sort of get people to say, wow, I learned something new at the end of the book, because I've been the reader who's read something about a movie I love, and I come out of it saying, I knew all those things, like I already knew that. Why didn't they ask this? And you get sort of upset. And I was like, that would be sort of the worst reaction, would be for fans to come to me and be like, you didn't get anything new. Like, why did you write? Like, I think that was like my fear, I guess, was that someone would say, I know all of this stuff. Like, what was the point of this? And it's been really, like I said, rewarding is like the word I'm going to keep coming back to, because I feel like, I did talk to a bunch of people, and I really wanted to get new facts or sort of get people to really talk about things that we've already heard. There were stories that I wanted to say, we've all seen them reported as rumor, and I really wanted to try to get some response, some answer. And even if it was sort of like, I don't remember this, I still wanted to get someone to talk about it. And, there were some things I still couldn't really get that, like, I can share or not share, but there was stuff that I was looking for that maybe I didn't get a solid answer, that's still sort of out there, that like I hope I can get at some point. I hope I can get an answer to it at a later date that I can share.
No, you're right about the contradictions, because I'm sure there's a part in the book where Kenny denies remembering filming in a swimming pool, and I'm like, there's photos of you in a swimming pool, and I'm like, how can you deny that? It's there in black and white. But I also think you're right. Now that the book's out there, I think it is very much still alive, and I think now that it's out there, hopefully that will nudge people to be like, oh, actually, yeah, I want to be involved in that, and I want to get in touch, hopefully.
Yeah, I would love that. I mean, I really do feel that way, that I'm like, if someone has a story to tell that maybe I missed them on the first round, or we didn't, because I think you reach out to a lot of people, and while I had more time than, you do as a journalist, you still have a deadline. So sometimes it just doesn't work out. Sometimes you send 80 emails and it just doesn't work out for whatever reason, people's schedules or things happen. And, there's all of those. And I mean, a funny story is that like Kenny Ortega almost wasn't in the book because we just could not find the time. And it was like a very last minute, I mean, the most last minute, we were like ready to send it off. And I got this interview with him. And so that was like a last minute addition. And what a wonderful last minute addition, because I was like, this movie could not be made, for obvious reason, could not be made without him. But it's, you, from seeing his other film, High School Musical, seeing those things, and Newsies, you can see how his style is involved in this movie in real ways. And so it was such an honor to get him to speak to me, because I know he's a busy person and he's talked about this movie a lot. And, it wasn't for lack of trying, and it wasn't for him being like, I don't want to do it. It was really just timing. He's a busy person to make the time. And again, I'm asking for people to give me an hour. I'm asking for people to give me a lot of time when you're busy to sit down with someone. And like I said, talk about a lot of things, talk about the making of, talking about your feelings, there's so much to do. But I feel like, that's sort of one of the fun things that I've liked telling people, where I'm just like, that interview came at the last minute. And it's such an amazing thing to have in there.
God, definitely. And he's peppered all throughout it, so you must have had to quickly put him in
Yeah.
everywhere. Yeah.
It was really fun, because I think at some point it became like a puzzle where you'd get someone and you'd be like, I need to ask them this specific question, and they're going to come in, they're going to pop in this one little spot, like you'd save a little spot for them. And it was just, it really was like putting together a puzzle. And like many nerdy people who love books, I also love puzzles. So it was very, very fun to be able to like put this together. But I mean, I want to say, of course, anyone who creates something, I feel like it's always, there's tough stuff that happens, but I would say most of this was so much fun. And it was just so much fun. I mean, you're talking to people about a movie that you really enjoy, and a movie that a lot of people enjoy. Like, if anything, I just felt like, I wanted to do right by the people I was speaking to. I wanted to do right by the fans. I wanted to do right by people who care about this movie and treat it with respect that it deserves. That these stories these are personal stories that people are sharing with you, and you want to do them justice. And, I hope I did. Everyone has been very kind so far, in responding or saying, oh, thank you for including something, or thank you for, putting this in, and that's again really nice. It really has been a great experience to like get the response from people, because you don't know what people are going to think once it's out there, and it's a very weird thing to have this book that you sort of worked on by yourself, and maybe some people saw it before it was released, but you really don't know what people think beyond like your editor, and you all feel like you're doing a good job. I mean, I guess it's like making a movie, in some ways it was an interesting experience to talk to people about making a movie that didn't get the reaction people wanted at first and then caught on. It was like, I felt like I could understand a little bit where it was like you're making something and you feel like you're doing good, but you're really not sure because no one else has like responded to you and you hasn't read it yet and you don't know. And again, I'm sure there are problems with it, and I'm sure there are things that people wish I did better or didn't, but everyone has been very kind to say, like, we can tell that you put your heart into this, you put a lot of work into that, and that really does mean something, because I feel like that's the one thing I kept coming back to is like, I might not answer every question or get every story, but I hope that it's clear that I tried. I really tried and wanted to, and wanted this to be, for the people in it, to be like a real look at what that experience was like, and try to get as close as I can to make it feel like what they felt in the moment of making it.
Well, I think you were worrying for nothing, because the book definitely included a lot of stuff that I didn't know. There was brand new stories. Was there any stories in particular that you didn't know or were shocked at from the Hocus Pocus lore from people?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many, because I feel like, I got to speak to fans who are so well versed in this and have done so much research, and who were so helpful because they shared that information with me, and they could have just kept it to themselves. But I think something I loved hearing about was this sort of like phantom VHS that exists out there that is, has some of the deleted scenes or different things on there, and that, Reddit, there's people on Reddit who swear it exists. So I really do believe, like, if you have a VHS that you think has Hocus Pocus, like, please check it, because you might have like this amazing piece of like memorabilia that I think we all want. And that was such a fascinating thing. But I think there was other stories, about how Kenny wasn't the first choice, or wasn't the first person who signed on as director. And it was really cool to speak to. It was Ron Underwood, who is someone who made Tremors, which is also like a cult classic, and City Slickers, which obviously is a huge movie. But he was sort of signed on to do it, and then, for reasons he doesn't even quite know, like, it sort of fell through. And it's sort of amazing to think about, oh, what if this version was made? How would it be different? And I love sort of talking to him, because he was very much like, I don't think I was the one who should have made it. Watching this version, it was clear that this shouldn't have been mine. This should have been someone else's. And I think that's a really cool thing to think about, where you're like, actually, maybe this wasn't right for me, and I'm happy it didn't work out, despite how popular this movie has become. I learned that there was a version of the movie in which they edited out, like, Jay and Ice, and they were no longer in it, but it didn't test well, because people really, liked those guys. And it's sort of, to think of it, because you're like, they are such fan favorites now, to imagine them not being in the movie is sort of like, what? How could that even be a thing? I think there's the story of, Michael Jackson trying to buy the Sanderson house and trying to bring it to Neverland, which, especially now, because I think fans wish that existed, wish that the house still stood. There's something very weird about the idea that, like, the biggest pop star at that time tried to buy it. Like, there's something very strange about that. But I think, there was just, I mean, I could go on and I will not, because I want people to read the book, but also because I don't, I hope this is enticing you. If you haven't read the book, maybe, like, learn more about these stories. But there was so many fun little things that someone would just say, and you'd be like, wait, like, it would stop me in my tracks to be like, I need to ask more about that, because that is such a funny story, or what a weird coincidence, or what a weird, like, there was definitely names of people who came up where I was like, wait, let's go back to that. I need to ask you more about this. Or, I think everyone was really, again, I think there were people I spoke to who would say, like, oh, I don't think I have very much to tell you. And then we'd be like 45 minutes in, and they'd be like, oh, wow, I remembered more than I thought. And that was really fun, because it really did feel like, for some people, it was like, it was jogging their memories. It was, oh, I forgot most of the stuff. And then you'd start saying, well, this person told me that maybe, this happened. And they would be like, oh, no, that's not what happened. Or they'd be like, oh my gosh, I remember that. And it was so much fun because it really did feel like I was like bringing back these memories that they had maybe like stored, but they were very, very deep in the basement, and I was like sort of coming in to take them out. Yeah, I was sort of unraveling this sweater they had made, but like it was, yeah, I mean that stuff was the most fun, was just hearing, like I said, like when we were sort of talking about like what's your favorite interview, it's like every single one, because everyone had something where I was just like, oh, this is really cool. Like I'm so happy that they told me this, because, and again, my favorite part was like playing detective, where it'd be like someone would tell me a story and then I'd be like, I have to go back to that person and ask them and see if they know and like hear what they said. And there was some funny stuff about, maybe some of my favorite stuff was just talking to Omri, who has been really open about having maybe be smoking pot on set during that time. And, there's nothing to be ashamed of about that. It was good fun for him. It wasn't anything dangerous, but he sort of very, very nicely was like, oh, no one knew that I was smoking on set. And almost immediately when I went back to everyone and said, oh, do you remember? And they were all like, yes, we did know. We were very aware. And it was one of my favorite things, because every person, it felt like an Arrested Development joke, where it was like him being like, no one knew. And it was like, everyone knew. Like Ron Howard comes in, because every person was like, no, we definitely knew. And then told the story about like how they knew. And it was so funny to like hear this, because they were all just like, no, no, he didn't hide it. But how sweet that he really felt that he had, he really believed it. So I think that was some of the fun stuff, was just trying to like get people to respond to, like I said, playing the detective of being like, someone said you did this, is this true? And them either being like, no, or yes, or, oh, I'm not going to talk about that. Or, like stuff that it was just really funny. And I know if it was silly things, there was no like, it wasn't a production that had a ton of like horrible things going on. It was very much innocent. It was a very innocent set, but I think that was the fun stuff. I mean, I think, Thora and Birch and Vanessa Shaw talk about, kind of maybe not bullying, but like talking to the like Boy Meets World guys and being like, we're on a movie and you're on a TV show, like stuff like that. Just imagining these kids, having this time on the Disney set. It sounds it feels very 90s, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said earlier is very interesting. I have friends who have kids, and they've sort of done it the other way around. They've shown their kids Hocus Pocus 2 first, and then they've shown them Hocus Pocus 1, and they all prefer Hocus Pocus 2.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much do you think nostalgia plays in our collective love of Hocus Pocus?
I mean, I think it's hard to deny how much it does, because even with myself, I'm like, I know this is a movie I saw as a kid, and it definitely, in ways that I think started to become clearer as I was like writing the book, and maybe will become clearer for some people who read the book, that I was like, oh, this movie is like very much ingrained in me, even just in the things I enjoy, just different movies that I enjoy now. I'm like, oh, I could see how it the thread from Hocus Pocus. But I don't think we can deny that nostalgia plays a role. But I will say, like, I think the interesting thing is that there are some movies from your childhood that I think you watch as a kid and you love, and then you see them as an adult and you're like, oh, this movie doesn't quite work, or this movie is very dated. I think this is not a rare movie, but it is a movie where when I saw it again, I was like, I could really find, even if there was stuff that could be dated, because it is from the night, like, the virgin stuff, obviously we don't expect to be in a movie today, especially a Disney movie. But I feel like there was things in it that I could so appreciate as an adult that I was like kind of unexpected to me, that it was like there were things I could grasp onto that I was like, oh, I didn't really catch that when I was a kid. And now as an adult, made me have a different appreciation or more appreciation for the movie. So while there's a nostalgia there, I think it doesn't just work as a nostalgia play. It's not just, I like it because I liked it as a kid. I think there's like more to it. But I could see where kids now, this is not like a movie that exists now. This is a very one-of-a-kind sort of thing. And I think it's very much, if you lived in the 90s and you watched a lot of 90s movies, this feels in line with some of the other stuff, but it feels different than stuff now. So I can understand where the second one is made with a new audience in mind. It's made with a younger generation in mind, and the movie feels more like those movies. Like, Hocus Pocus 2 has more in common with movies now than it does with its original source material. And that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That is clearly a choice to make sure that like kids now have their own Hocus Pocus. So, I think that's a lot of it, is that I think if I was a younger kid, I would probably have the same feelings. I would probably be like, Hocus Pocus 2, it's colorful, and then there's music, there's more music in it, it's so bright. I think there's just a lot of things in it that feel more for this time. And I think, I personally think that's great. I don't think the second one needs to be for me. I like that it's actually for kids that maybe have or have not seen Hocus Pocus, who love witches and they want to watch this movie. I think it can be that on its own, like for kids. And maybe that's the fun part about it, is little kids are going to watch this movie now and say, I love it. And they're going to be tweens and they're going to see Hocus Pocus and be like, oh, I'm into this now. Like, this is what I'm into. And, oh, they're connected. Wow, that's really cool, So I don't know. I think there's some people who seemed a little upset about Hocus Pocus 2 in terms of like, not being like the first movie, which I understand. You're hoping that you'll get that same feeling. But I think, I don't know, I went into it with the idea that it's made for a different generation, and how wonderful that is, that we have this other movie that maybe little kids will be into and can learn to love Hocus Pocus, or will love them as a tandem. That seems lovely.
And hopefully these little kids don't have to wait 30 years for Hocus Pocus 3.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like, I hope that it's more like, I hope a Hocus Pocus 3 or a TV series, something comes out of this. I think like it would be fun to see a cinematic universe that is Hocus Pocus, because I think they built it in. I know I know Jason Marsden is looking at trying to do some sort of animated. I think I read that from you, but I saw him sort of talking about doing an animated Binks, adventure sort of series, and that sounds great. I love that idea. I think, why can't this be spun off into, a Billy Butcherson show or the Young Witches, or why can't this be a world? I think if the fans want it, I'm like, give it to them. That sounds great. I feel like it's, Star Wars has its own universe. Marvel, why not? Why not Hocus Pocus? They could have a cinematic universe. The thing that I learned most from making the book is the fan base is the legacy to me. I think the legacy of this movie is the fan base. I think, like we sort of talked about, like Hocus Pocus 2 does not get made without the fans. There's no way that 30 years later a sequel comes to a movie that doesn't have a fan base that is like looking for it. And I think what I was learning by, writing this book was just how these fans started, these real like diehard fans started to come not that long after the movie was released. They were just quieter and the internet didn't exist, so there wasn't that community. But the drag community has been on top of this movie for decades. There is a lot of fans who have been around from the very beginning. And something I loved about it was that I think there could be some fan bases that would say, it's grown enough. We don't need any more new fans. This is ours. We want to, take this. This is ours, and be very protective of it. And what I really liked was talking to people was how many were like, oh, I give copies of Hocus Pocus to my friends because I want everyone to see this movie. I want everyone to be a fan of this movie. I want more Hocus Pocus. I want more merch. For the early days of this movie, there was no merch. There was no official merch. People were making their own. People were making their DIY, Etsy versions of these things. Only now do we see tons of merch. I just think all of that stuff is really special. And I think that's something about the movie, especially right now when we talk about fandoms maybe being toxic. This was a fandom where I was really surprised by just how gentle and kind they were, but also how they are sort of, ringing the bell for this movie, in that they want more people to see it. They want more people to love it. They want more people to be on the bandwagon with them. They aren't deterring people because they weren't there from the beginning. It really did feel like something special to me, because at once I'm like, I don't know where this movie will be in 30 years. Will it still be played as many times? I think it'll still be popular, and I think it will still be a go-to Halloween movie for so many people. But like we said, the Hocus Pocus 2 may become for some kids their movie. So will that be played more? Not maybe more than Hocus Pocus, but will it be played more during Halloween season? Maybe. But I think like the legacy of this movie is the fans and how they really repped for it. And like you said, brought up that these people in the movie feel so much better to talk about this movie now and talk about their love for it than they did even 10, 15 years ago, I feel like those fans really like brought this movie to where it is. And I think its legacy will be that it will be more than the movie. It'll really be the fans of the movie. And I hope that's maybe the story we tell of sort of the idea of, you know, we know about the Snyder Cut and we know about different things where fans have sort of gotten studios to do more, but I think this was done in a different way. And so I hope that at some point, like, you know, I tried to make sure that was in the book, but I think there's probably so much to be written about like this fan base and what they've done to make this and to make Disney take this movie seriously in a way that maybe they didn't think they had to for a really long time.